folks. Excuse me. Hello again, folks. Continue on here. In recent years, most scholars have interpreted the Roosevelt-Taft dispute in Roosevelt's favor. In the prevailing academic view, Roosevelt is described as active, expansionist, and strong. The historical reality, in fact, does not afford such a sharp distinction either between the actions of these two presidents or between their analysis of the problem of executive powers. Taft, in his concluding remarks to his Columbia lectures, said, "Executive power is limited, so far as it is possible to limit such a power, consistent with that discretion and promptness of action that are essential to preserve the interest of the public in times of emergency or legislative neglect or inaction." Thus, even Taft was disposed to employ emergency power when the need arose, but he did not wish to go beyond his own narrower, conservative conception of what was meant by constitutional and legal bounds. Thus, the dispute was over where those bounds lay rather than the nature of the office itself. Taft's successor, Woodrow Wilson, was no less zealous in observing what he thought the Constitution demanded. Faced with the existent exigencies of World War I, Wilson found it necessary to expand executive emergency powers enormously. In many respects, this expansion of powers in wartime was based on precedents set by Lincoln decades earlier. Unlike Lincoln, however, Wilson relied heavily on Congress for official delegations of authority, no matter how broadly these might be. Wilson's exercise of power in the First World War provided a model for future presidents and their advisors. During the preparedness period of 1915 to 1916, the submarine crisis in the opening months of 1917, and the period of direct involvement of U.S. Armed Forces from April 1917 to November 1918. Wilson utilized powers as sweeping as Lincoln's because governmental agencies were more highly organized and their jurisdictions wider. Presidential powers were considerably more effective than ever before. Yet, perhaps because of Wilson's scrupulous attention to obtaining prior congressional concurrence, there was only one significant congressional challenge to Wilson's wartime measures. His scrupulous attention to detail? Well, where was that at when the damn the beast from Jekyll Island, the Federal Reserve Act, and the 17th Amendment, which was never ratified, where was he at on that? Well, hey, this is a government publication, by the way, so I guess there you go. That's the reason why there's double speak in it. All right. That challenge came in February through March of 1917, following the severance of diplomatic relations with Germany. A group of senators successfully filibustered a bill authorizing the arming of American merchant ships. In response, American historian Frank Friedel, F-R-E-I-D-E-L, in his book Roosevelt, the Apprenticeship Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Franklin D. Roosevelt found an old statute under which the president could proceed without fresh authorization from Congress. Roosevelt, impatient for action, was irritated because Wilson waited a few days before implementing the statute. Lincoln had drawn most heavily upon his powers as commander-in-chief. Wilson exercised emergency power on the basis of old statutes and sweeping new legislation, thus drawing on congressional delegation as a source of authority. The most significant Wilsonian innovations were economic. Yeah, we know that. We're still riding that pony. Including a wide array of defense and war agencies modeled to some extent upon British wartime presidents. In August 1916, just prior to the United States entry into the war, Congress, at Wilson's behest, established a council of national defense, primarily advisory. In 1917, a War Industries Board, also relatively weak, began operating. The ineffectiveness of the economic mobilization led Republicans in Congress in the winter of 1917 to 1918 to demand a coalition war cabinet similar to that in England. Wilson forestalled Congress by proposing legislation delegating him almost total economic power, and even before legislative approval, authorized the War Industries Board to exercise extensive powers. Subsequently, Congress enacted Wilson's measure, the Overman Act, in April 1918. Other legislation extended the economic authority of the government in numerous directions. All right, when I had my old channel as SKeene1956, I get into this a little bit about Wilson and where he was being blackmailed for $40,000 by parties unknown, let's say, because of his indiscretion of having an affair with a fellow professor at Princeton University. And it came back to haunt him when he was in the White House. And he said he couldn't pay it. He didn't say he wouldn't pay it, he said he couldn't. So he was approached another time. And he again stated he couldn't pay it. He didn't have the money. But the person with the proof of the infidelity, which was love letters, proposed to Wilson that Wilson, in exchange, this man would pay the $40,000. In exchange, Wilson would grant him a favor when he came in and asked for it. What was that favor? The appointment of a specific person on the Supreme Court. If you want to, I can dig all that back up too, Doesn't matter to me. Just need you to understand what's going on. Now, here's where things get weird. Following the Allied victory, Wilson relinquished his wartime authority and asked Congress to repeal the emergency statutes enacted to fight more effectively the war. Only a food control measure and the 1917 Trading with the Enemy Act were retained. This procedure of terminating emergency powers when the particular emergency itself has in fact ended has not been consistently followed by his successors. Let me check my time. Thank you. The next major development in the use of executive emergency powers came under Franklin D. Roosevelt. The Great Depression had already overtaken the country by the time of Roosevelt's inauguration and confronted him with a totally different crisis. This emergency, unlike those of the past, presented a non-military threat. The Roosevelt administration, however, conceived the economic crisis to be a calamity equally as great as a war and employed the metaphor of war to emphasize the Depression's severity. In his inaugural address, Roosevelt said, "I shall ask the Congress for the one remaining instrument to meet the crisis, broad executive power to wage a war against the emergency, as great as the power that would be given me if we were in fact invaded by a foreign foe." Well, here I'm going to put my foot into my butt myself, because many people who have ever spoken about the Federal Reserve Act and the Federal Reserve Bank, and they get too vocal, they've had a bullet put in their head. Examples: Lincoln and Kennedy. Now, the Federal Reserve Act is passed in 1913, yet we have a Great Depression. And the Federal Reserve Act was passed because it promised to never have that happen again. What happened? Did somebody fall asleep? Did somebody put a Mickey in somebody's drink? Okay, I'm about out of time again. This, like I said, is not too long, but it's a long document. So please have forbearance, as this is real stuff from the government that I've got that I'm reading to you. I will post it on my Ning site.